What's up, guys? Today I wanted to share a rebalancing strategy to minimize impermanent loss. A lot of people call it the snuggle rebalance. It's not too hard to perform, but there's a lot of things to understand because if you do it wrong, you could easily lock in a ton of impermanent loss. If you guys are new here, my name is Richard. I've been yield farming for a while now, still sitting on a 4.26 ETH of profit, even though a lot of small to mid cap altcoins are pulling back. Closed position still sits at 8.6 Ethereum profit. These values fluctuate a lot from time to time, depending on how these tokens do, but overall still in a nice profit. And hopefully as the altcoin prices recover, I could be at a larger profit. And before we dive in, none of this is financial advice. Please do your own research before making any financial decisions. So let's get right to the rebalancing part. So rebalancing is kind of like when you're sick and you need to go to a doctor to solve the problem. So rebalancing, in my opinion, is not something that you should be doing very often at all. You only want to rebalance if you really need to. That's how you should think about rebalancing. It's not something that you got to do all the time, especially if you guys run wider ranges like I do. So let's say you guys were yield farming with fairly wide ranges since last year, right? Let's say your upper range was 4,100. And then let's say you entered around 2,500 here. And then your bottom range could be at roughly $2,000. So let's run that simulation here. The value of deposit, let's say I started with $100. Value upper 4,100. Price lower could be 2,000. And let's say I deposited at 2,500, right? And then price deposit, price now is at 2,500. So let's say this is our initial condition and the price just moves around. It doesn't matter, right? But for some reason, let's say Ethereum drops all the way to 1,500, which was what we saw earlier this year, right? So if Ethereum drops all the way to 1,500 and I decide to rebalance, what a lot of people teach in terms of snuggle rebalance is basically dragging down your bottom range to, let's say, 1,500 and then keep the upper range at the same exact price. So I can try and do that with the simulation. But before I do that, I want to figure out how much my LP value would be when I withdraw the liquidity pool, right? At $1,500, this is the LP value here, 62.30262. I want to copy that number, and then I'm going to change this value deposit here to that number because when I rebalance, it's going to be at this value, right? Price lower, I change it to 1,500 to snuggle rebalance. Price deposit 1,500. So you can see here, this value deposit is this new dollar amount. And I've basically performed a snuggle rebalance in this case. And let's simulate how the price would move. And this is what a lot of people did back here, right? To minimize impermanent loss. And then after a short while, the price basically shot back up to this $2,500 mark. So I could simulate that as well by changing this price now back to 2,500. But what you're going to notice here, if I click on this line, my LP value would now be only worth 90.48642 because I only snuggled with the bottom range. I'm going to be selling Ethereum at a much more aggressive price. That's why I only end up with 90.48 US dollar at this original entry. Versus if I hadn't rebalanced at all, I would still be at $100, right? So in this case, I've locked in roughly 9.5% of impermanent loss. And it could be worth it or not worth it depending on the APR that you've been generating, right? Let's say you had that old range of 2,000 to 4,100, but because you were in range for quite a long time and you don't mind locking in that impermanent loss, then of course you could do that. But a better way, in my opinion, is that you're going to basically snuggle the same way, but I also want to adjust the upper range. Let's say I just move it to 8,000, double the original upper range, right? You could see at the original price, my LP value jumps all the way to $94.533. So in this case, I would lock in less than 5.5% of impermanent loss. And I could even extend this to max range, right? Let's say to billions, effectively infinity, right? You could see at the original entry, the impermanent loss I locked in is only 1.5%. And as long as my fees could cover that, then I'm more than happy to lock in that impermanent loss by snuggling it this way. So It's very simple, right? What we're going to do instead of just moving the bottom range, I'm going to move the bottom range and then move the upper range as well. And once the price is near my original entry at 2500, I could always rebalance into the original range again, where I put like the bottom range to be at 2000 and then the upper range to be at 4100. And then in that case, I would have very little apparent loss. But one thing to watch out for is, let's say Ethereum drops all the way to $1,000. If I do a snuggle, in that case, I would be losing much more to apparent loss. So there's a theoretical max price before you suffer more and more apparent loss, right? I will show you guys once again. Let's say I start at 100 with the original range at 4100 on the top side. Price lower at 2000, price now 2500, price deposit 2500. So this is the original scenario, right? But let's say Ethereum drops now all the way to $1,000. So here my LP value would be only worth $41.53, right? I'm going to copy that because I'm rebalancing at that price point, right? That's my new value deposit. I paste it here. And then if you guys use the snuggle strategy that most other people uses, you change only the bottom range, right, to 1000 and then price deposit at 1000, right? What you're going to find is that if I change this price now to 2500, my LP value would only be $76. So this is how you guys could lose a ton of money really quickly by snuggling only the bottom range. And then when the prices recover, you end up with much less capital than what you started out with. And let's say I expand the top range, like what I just taught you guys, right, to like near infinity. Even if you rebalance all the way down to $1,000, you would still end up with $89.8. So you've locked in roughly 10% of impermanent loss. Compared to what we had before at 4100 upper range, you would have locked in like, over 20 something percent of impermanent loss. So in a lot of cases, I don't want to like rebalance down so aggressively because I would still suffer like a 10% of impermanent loss, right? If my goal is to minimize impermanent loss, then I don't want to snuggle down that much. So the price lower, let's say I change to 1600. So I'm going to keep everything exactly the same, right? I deposited at this $1,000 mark. The price now is at 2500, but I changed the lower mark to only $1,600. So that's my new lower bound. And as price recover to 2500, I could click this value here. You can see I would have locked in less than 1% of the impermanent loss, right? This is because I only started selling my Ethereum at this $1,600 mark. And you guys could play with this number to find the number that you're happy with, right? Let's say you only want to snuggle down to 1700. You can see at the original LP value, I would actually be at a slight profit here. So that's also a very important thing to understand. When you guys snuggle down, the lower you snuggle, the more impermanent loss you're going to be locking in. And the second thing is what we just talked about. If you guys don't adjust the upper range, you're going to also be locking in a ton of impermanent loss. So I hope that makes sense. And let's run through another example with a crypto to crypto pool so that you guys see the picture really, really clear, right? Let's use Arrow to ETH as an example. So let's say you were yield farming Arrow and ETH at this 0.0007 mark. This is priced in Ethereum terms. I've changed the quote asset to Ethereum. And this is how I like to look at my chart because if this price is trading above my entry, then I'm at a net Ethereum profit, right? What I want to do is, let's say I entered here at 0.0003, and then let's say I have a more aggressive bottom range here at 0.00025. Let's say I entered back here, right? But you could see I would have been doing well for quite a while until the price exited my bottom range. And if I decide to snuggle rebalance, I could run the simulations for that. So let's key in that information here. Let's say I started with 1 Ethereum. So that's the V deposit. And then price upper, let's say I do 0.0007, right? Price lower, 0.00025. Let's say I entered at 0.0003 and I can change all of the numbers here. So what I want to do now is, let's say the price moves pretty aggressively towards the downside to all the way at 0.00017. I can change this price now number to this number here, 0.00017. you would see that my LP value would drop all the way to this right number here, 0.57756 worth of Ethereum. If you guys want to know the arrow tokens, then you could take the right number, which is 0.057756, divide that by that price here on the left side, 0.00017, then that comes out to roughly 3397 arrow tokens. But what's really more important here is this Ethereum value. If I decided to snuggle rebalance, then I want to change this value of deposit because that's how much my LP would be worth at that new position, right? So price of deposit, I want to change that to 0.00017. And then price lower is at also 0.00017. So in this case, if I only snuggle the bottom range, we're doing what a lot of people teaches is if I move the bottom range here to 0.00017 without touching the top range, right? Then what we do is change the price now to our original entry at 0.0003. And then if I click here, you can see my LP value would now be worth less than 1 Ethereum at this 0.8964 ETH here. So this strategy doesn't work if you're trying to minimize impermanent loss. And for like low APR pools, this could be actually really bad, right? Because if you guys look here, this arrow pool only generates like 30 something percent APR. And if I did a snuggle rebalance here, it's basically taking most of my profit margin, right? I would have to be in range for at least 4 months to even cover the impermanent loss. So this doesn't work, right? But let's say I change the upper range to near infinity. At the old price, you could see my LP value would jump all the way to 0.9569. So that's still not good, right? Because I would be still locking in like 4 something percent of impermanent loss. So I don't want the price lower to be that aggressive. I might change it to 0.0002, for example, and then I could see the LP value. So 0.9849, not too bad, roughly 1.5% down from my original price. So if I want to minimize that further, I would play with this lower bound number, right? Until I find that at this original entry, my LP value would be 1. So close to 1 here, I could bump that up to 0.00022. So right there, 0.998. That's theoretically like the max lower range that I could go down to before I start suffering more and more impermanent loss. So I started with like 0.00025, right? And then I could go down to 0.00022. And then as the price recovered to my original entry at 0.003, I could squeeze the range again if I want to, back to the old range, right? 0.0007. And then the lower range could be 0.00025 if I'm trying to basically get more APR out of this pool. So really important concept to understand. You can't just move down the lower range. And then, when the prices recover, you actually locked in a ton of impermanent loss, right? You want to move the lower bound as well as expand the upper bound. And if you're trying to really minimize impermanent loss, then you could set the upper bound to be near infinity. Because when you do that, whatever tokens you're LPing is being sold slowly back into Ethereum. In this case, for Arrow to ETH at the best possible price for a concentrated liquidity pool. And then the second thing to remember is that you can't rebalance down too aggressively. If you guys do that, then you'll be selling your tokens at a cheap price, which is what is causing you to lock in that impermanent loss. Like if I rebalance my lower bound to all the way to 0.0001, right? Then the impermanent loss would be much worse. So that's something to keep in mind. And you should always run through the calculation that I showed you guys before you do any rebalancing. That's why it's not a very good strategy to be rebalancing very often. A lot of times people that chase ranges, they end up with less and less capital than what they started out with. It's never worth it in my opinion. And that's why I like to start off wide rather than, start off tight here. Let's say I yield farm with like really tight ranges like this, right? Prices move down and then exits my range. And then I have to run through a bunch of different simulation. Okay, how do I minimize impermanent loss? And then I found out that, okay, I can't rebalance down too much because then I would, suffer a ton of impermanent loss, right? And then I'm basically stuck into this position. That's why I tell most people, my students, my clients, that they should be basically looking at their weekly charts to be setting the ranges, right? A lot of people look at daily charts or they don't look at charts at all to set ranges. I think that's a huge mistake. We should be trying to capture the price action based on the weekly chart at the minimum. So I hope that makes sense, guys, and I hope this helped you out. Rebalancing is one of those things that you hope that you don't have to do very often. And when you guys do it incorrectly, that's how a lot of beginners could lose a ton of money while they're yield farming. If you guys like that video, be sure to check out my other videos. I try my best to help you guys become a better yield farmer so that you can make more consistent profits. And if you guys want to be notified when I release a new video, be sure to hit that notification bell. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you guys next time.